So welcome everyone to this webinar on social innovation through living labs. My name is Myriam Berube and I'm consulting director at the Tamarack Institute. And this webinar is the fourth of a monthly series on place-based Quebec, where we are featuring a diversity of experiences made in Quebec. As we all know, our communities are facing increasingly complex social and environmental challenges as well that require new solutions. Within those promising community innovation practices, living labs are generating more and more buzz, and yet there is some confusion, I would say, about what they are, when to use them, and what they can help us achieve. So today I have the great pleasure to have with me two speakers from LLio and LLio. I will introduce them to you in a few moments, that will share with us their experiences and insights on living labs, and hopefully will deepen our understanding of this very promising social innovation method. I also would like to acknowledge and thank the Canadian Relations and Support Program for its financial support for this webinar. And as we start, I want to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous land. And as settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. I am myself calling on from the traditional territory of the Guinean-Gehaga people. Jojage, which is colonially known as Montreal, has traditionally been a place of gathering for many First Nations. So I'm grateful to live, work, and play here in the traditional territory of the Guinean-Gehaga. So I will now introduce our speakers. Next, please. So with us today, two amazing speakers and great colleagues. Hugo Steban is the Director of Social Entrepreneurship at the Maison de l'Innovation Sociale that we call La MIS. He has been with MIS since its funding in 2017. And Jean-Francois Jasmin is the project manager at the Living Lab en Innovation Ouverte. So he coaches groups in the design, planning, and implementation of Living Lab approaches. So thank you very much to both of you for being with us today. If you want to learn more about our speakers, I invite you to read their full bio on the landing page of this webinar. So to start this conversation, I'd like to hear from both of you in a few words. What is important to you about community innovation? Who would like to start? Jean-Francois?
I can start. Hi, everybody. Maybe just a quick word about the LLio, the Living Lab in Open Innovation. We're basically an applied research center whose mission is to foster the adoption of open innovation practices in communities and organizations. And I'd say that for that specific question, it's closely linked with what we are hoping to achieve, which is to involve communities, citizens, and users in the innovation process, basically to co-develop innovation that concerns them.
Thank you, Jean-Francois, for sharing that. What about you, Hugo? What's important to you about community innovation?
In the world of innovation in general, there's a certain glorification of what we call disruptive innovation. And I think that it's misguided, especially in the world of social innovation and community innovation. I think when we're talking about system change and game-changing innovation, we should have more focus on making sure that we design innovation with a certain elegance, so innovations that are in coherence and respects of the context in which they're deployed. And what a coincidence, this is well aligned with the intentions behind Living Labs, which we're going to talk to you about in the next few minutes.
Thank you so much, Hugo. So to start this conversation on Living Lab, we can move on to the next. Can you, Hugo, explain us what Living Labs are and why they are different from other social innovation methods, so that we start getting some clarification around some of the buzz and the confusion that I mentioned in my introduction that has been going on about Living Labs. So on to you, Hugo.
Yes, Living Labs aren't the simplest innovation devices. So we're gonna present you with a Living Labs in its simplest form. So if there's any Living Lab purists in the room with us today, we could have chats or training sessions that would last days or weeks. But since we only have an hour together, we're gonna go to its simplest form. Before going into the theory, I suggest that we start by presenting you with l'Acadie, which is a living lab focused on the rehabilitation of agroecosystems surrounding the l'Acadie River watershed on the south shore of Montreal, which has been in activity since 2015. So we're going to start with the narrative, and then we're going to come back and explain to you exactly what was behind the narrative in terms of the concepts and the frameworks. The Acadie Lab was born from the meeting in 2014 of an agronomist, a biologist, a professor in the Department of Environmental Sciences at Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières, and our own Virginie Zingraf, Senior Advisor for Skills Transfer Design and Innovation here at MIS. They came together with a common observation, which was that intensive agriculture practices in the region were destroying the agroecosystems. Researchers were working on developing new solutions, but the generated knowledge wasn't percolating in farmers' practices. When there was subsidies or financing to do so, the practices usually were abandoned as soon as the subsidies subsided, and then the farmers went back to the old ways of doing things. On the other side, action plans and strategies were developed by public actors and then kind of pushed on the producers. We kind of all know the process of diagnosis, objectives, action plan, and then promotion to the farmers to see them hopefully implement the plans. And on the side of the farmers, they felt like their priority, reality, and experiential knowledge weren't taken into consideration, and thus didn't really feel concerned and responsible for deploying these strategies. And at the end of the day, basically nothing happened on that point. Driven by the desire to re-examine ways of doing environmental management project, these four people got together, and what they did in the first year is structure the Living Lab. So they mobilize a diversity of actors. What we see in Living Lab is people from the public sector, the private sector, from research, and the users and citizen sectors that were concerned by the issue and interested in contributing to its resolution. They co-defined together a common objective that they wanted to work on, which was to rehabilitate the l'Acadie River agroecosystem through the design, adoption, and diffusion of innovations in the region. They made known to each other their own respective interests and objectives in collaborating on the initiative, and made sure to plan for an equitable distribution of the value that would be generated through the writing of a charter to ensure that the users would be put at the center of the initiative, and the initiative was beneficial to everybody who participated in terms of the different values that was generated. Then pull together resources, expertise, capacities, and funding. And a year later, the Acadie Lab, Living Lab, was launched, ready to launch its first innovation cycle. Since then, a series of projects have been piloted, and what we've seen is innovation being successfully deployed, which has supporting the objective of rehabilitating the ecosystem. It has generated shared knowledge among the stakeholders and the ecosystem more largely on the understanding of the obstacles and levers that could support the deployment of these innovations. It has helped develop social capital between the stakeholders and participants, which contributed to a stronger culture of collaboration, which has had ripple effect in the community, even outside the Living Lab. And we've seen that it even affected values and behaviors among the participants, and among other things, developing a stronger sense of shared stewardship of the agro-system's health. So now that we've seen the case, we can jump in more of the conceptual approach. So next slide, please. For starters, if we bring it to its simplest form, Living Labs can be conceived as being composed of two main components with particular specificities: a platform from which projects are launched, and then the projects themselves. Next slide, please. When we're talking about the platform, we're first and foremost talking about a coalition of stakeholders. As I said earlier on, 4 different types of stakeholders are going to be represented, mainly the research sector, public, enterprises, whether they be service, product, technology providers, and users, or in the case of community innovation, we'll also be talking about citizens and community actors that are brought together around a common need for innovation. So we're not talking about a specific problem that can be solved in one shot. We're talking more about a sandbox from which can spring various different projects to address the issue. The partners can have different interests and individual objectives, but they all share that common need for innovation, and also a common objective to understand that the difference between invention and innovation is adoption, and to make sure that we get a better understanding of the adoption parameters within the community of the solutions that they wish to deploy. There's always this question of a pooling of resources, so people will bring different infrastructures, capacities, financing, etc., and knowledge. So we're talking about academic knowledge, but also professional, and this is key here for Living Lab, usage and contextual knowledge, which is detained by the users and the people living in the community. It's not only present, but it's at the forefront. And then, as we explained earlier on, making sure that there's an equitable distribution of value created so participation is beneficial for everybody involved. Since the action space of Living Labs is this question of adoption, I think we should go a bit more into this question. So if we can go to the next slide. When we're talking about adoption, we're not talking about social acceptability or getting people in communities to accept solutions that they wouldn't otherwise need or want. We're really focusing on this question of making a novelty compatible with its environment. So there's a co-adaptation between the innovation being deployed, the response from the people, and so on and so forth, so that we develop innovations that fit rather than disrupt the users' practices and the community, and generates added value, which is the point of innovation. If we go to the next slide, we're going to be looking at adoption at two different levels when we talk about compatibility with the environment. So at the user level, we're going to be talking about different factors here, saying, is it valuable? Is it useful? Is it usable? Is it credible, accessible? So really focusing on making sure that we really understand the users of the innovation in their own context, and making sure that it's as seamless as possible in terms of the adoption and the value that is created. And on the other side, not only on the user level, but at the community level, we're going to be talking compatibility in terms of technical level. So does it fit with the technologies in place, the knowledge, the systems, the different services and products already available in the community? Does it fit at a social level? So are we compatible with the values, the norms, the culture that are in place in the community? And on a territorial level, so in terms of resources, in terms of local specificities, strengths and weaknesses, infrastructures in place, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. So we talked about the structure or the platform side of Living Labs. Now let's talk about the project side. First of all, we're going to talk about projects that are co-led by its users and piloted through an iterative process in real-time, real-life conditions. When we're talking about Living Labs, the real-life conditions is the living part of the Living Labs. Next slide. When we're talking about like the inherited culture of innovation and even more contemporary practices such as design thinking are user-centered, which is that they put the users and the communities as people and things that the experts will observe, define what's good for them, conceive an innovation, and then push this innovation on the users with a perspective of acceptability of this innovation, with the unconscious bias of not seeing the users as experts in their own field. When we're talking about Living Labs, we try to switch the narrative on this. The user is positioned as an expert at the same level as the others, and even more so because the users are holders of a huge baggage of experiential, contextual, and usage knowledge, which is tacit in nature and very hard to transfer to other participants. So the users aren't only an object that is observed for the experts to provide a solution, but they play a proactive role in identifying priorities, selecting experiments and designing and piloting these experiments. If we take the example of the l'Acadie Lab, the farmers were actually the ones that selected the experiments that were done to make sure that we really put the user priorities and the user needs at the center of the initiative. Now, if we talk about the next slide, if we talk about the iterative process, a living lab is really geared towards generating learnings. So it's something that's piloted through an iterative process because we never really know what we're gonna have in terms of knowledge or results at the end of a cycle. So we're gonna go through first co-creation, so bringing people together to make sure that we explicit the needs, the wants, the issues, the mental models, and define possible solutions that will then be on which we will deepen our understanding through research, validation, interviews, and so on and so forth, which will be the basis for designing, building, and testing prototypes in real-life conditions. When we talk about real-life conditions, we differentiate it from realistic conditions or lab conditions. As you all know, reality is complex, and it has a lot of different interconnected components that can produce unpredictable effects when we do experiments. Some call it like the famous butterfly effect kind of thing. If we do an experiment in a realistic or lab context, we consciously or unconsciously exclude some of these components from the experience, which has the potential of generating false learnings. So this question of making sure that we do experiments in real life settings is key here. And when we're talking about the learnings, we're going to be talking about participative evaluation, where every stakeholder is part in identifying what are the insights, what are the learning, and really focusing on, among other things, identifying paradoxes. So what was said to us versus what happened on the field, and really trying to see where the discourse is different from the action. This is usually where you get the real nuggets and wisdom for these things. So this is the 4-step iterative process. And if we go to the next slide, what we have to know is that it's not something that is a one-time thing. As we said, we never really know what kind of learnings we're going to get at the end of one process. So it can be repeated many different times in a phase before we go to the next one and then the next one. And going up can also bring new learnings that gets us to go back down. So it's really this idea of going up and down in terms of different lenses through which we look at the different user needs and adoption parameters. First of all, we're going to be focusing on the why. So this whole idea of understanding what's the value that it brings to the user, what's the usefulness, does the user estimate that the solution provides him or her with a solution to its problems? Second of all, we'll be looking at the when and the where. So is the innovation findable in the environment? Is it accessible? Is it usable by this user? And third, we're going to be looking at the adoption in its larger environment, the with whom. So as we said, compatibility with the technical systems, the values and norms, the specificities on the context, the peripheral stakeholders that have an influence on this adoption. So as I said, at any step of this process, it's possible to do one or more iterations until we feel confident enough to go to the next step, just as learning in subsequent steps can have the impact of the project getting back to previous steps. Since we don't know what we're going to discover, we can predict where we want to go, but can't predict exactly how we're going to get there. It's at the end of the iteration that we know where we'll go. So in a nutshell, it's probably the purest form of the explanation of what a living lab is. And maybe just to make sure that we do like a little summary in terms of the distinctive aspects, there's one thing that's distinctive from the other social innovation methods is the question of the action space. There is no other innovation practice that is as focused and performing on the subject of understanding adoption, which ironically is one of the key success factors of innovation. Also, it's an initiative that is based on a coalition of partners in which the users play a proactive role at the same level as the other stakeholders. It's an initiative that is structured in a way to make transparent the individual objective of the partner and to plan ahead in ensuring that we have an equitable distribution of value. So we're not only inviting users and citizens and community actors for the public actors or the private actors objectives, but really making sure that it's beneficial to everyone and putting this in the most transparent way possible. This whole question of focus on experimenting in real life condition, so the living part of Living Lab. And at the end of the day, it's not only a project-based approach, but it's also an innovation platform, which is what gives the Living Labs the potential having a much more transformative impact than the sum of its projects in the communities in which you're deployed. When we were talking about the l'Acadie Lab, we looked at the stronger connection, the culture of collaboration, the trust that was built, and even the shared sense of stewardship of the community in which the innovation was deployed.
Thank you so much, Hugo. This is amazing. I really enjoyed how you kicked us off with the l'Acadie Lab. I wish we could hear more about this inspiring example that is much, much needed in terms of regenerating rivers and agricultural lands. So thank you for sharing that, and also for walking us through in such an accessible way through all the different components of Living Labs. It's really clear. I'm looking forward to see the questions that our participants are going to have for you. And I want to say that I really, really loved the distinction that you made between the user-centered and community-led. At Tamarack, we value two kinds of expertise: the content expertise, which we all know about, and the context expertise. So having at the heart of the initiatives people with lived or living experience of the issues that we are trying to solve. And this is really what I find especially inspiring about this approach. So thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. We'll move on to Jean-Francois. So we've heard about Living Labs, what they are, how they work. Can you tell us a bit more about the conditions of success? Like, how can they be effective in place-based work at the community level?
So I'd say that one intention of the Living Lab is to understand the barriers to adoption at the user and community level. So they bring around the table all stakeholders on an equal footing. There's a preponderant place for citizens and community actors, a bearer of contextual, of usage knowledge, and they allow for a certain credibility in that sense of the innovation that will be co-developed and documented throughout the approach. So another thing is that they favor equitable distribution of the benefits, and hopefully it's going to be defined in advance. And they generate a diversity of results, both on the object of the innovation and in terms of process, definitely. The result is of different nature and it emerged throughout the innovation cycle. You can move.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, so thank you for this, Jean-Francois. Maybe you want to tell us a bit more about the benefits of community, or Hugo, if you want to jump in. What are some of the benefits for communities of adopting an approach such as Living Labs?
What, if I may, I will introduce two examples in order to show you some of the benefits that you can look for in a Living Lab. So the two examples are other Living Lab projects that are currently in operation, and it's a good way to look at another place-based innovation context. The first one, it focuses on helping Laurentian tourism businesses and destinations to identify, develop, and experiment.
Yeah,
it's the next slide, I'm sorry.
No,
and experiment with the concrete solution for adapting to climate change and reducing the greenhouse gases. So in this context, the coalition of stakeholders is composed of the Tourism Development Association, the tourism enterprise, which are the main users, There's municipalities of different places in the Laurentians, and a climate change research center and a sustainable development fund. So in this living lab, they work in work groups that are formed around the common adaptation needs. And all the participants in this living lab will bring together their point of view, their expertise and know-how on how they perceive and how they adapt to climate change in their respective contexts. So they collectively develop infrastructure most of the time in this particular living lab. It's about infrastructure that are adapted to climate change and to cope with the effect of those changes in their regions. But one thing that is quite interesting is that the collaboration manifesto stipulates that all the knowledge developed by the actors within this living lab will be distributed to all the tourism actors in the Laurentian region. So it goes much beyond the actual group of partners. So this is a more, let's say, enterprise-oriented or business-oriented living lab. And the other one that I would like to talk about, it's called La Main Courante. And it focuses on the reintegration into employment of marginalized population living in the northern Quebec region with a special focus on Indigenous people. The community or the coalition of actors there is made of the external employment resources working at the community level, which is the main user there. There's the Public Employment Agency, it's the ministry in Quebec. And there's the professional educators, people that are hired in order to be facilitators and coordinators. So they are trained managers, let's say, of this living lab. And they gathered in what we call a cell, an innovation cell. The actors work together through every step of a design thinking-like process, which is quite unprecedented in the way they collaborate normally. So there's a certain level of horizontality and power distribution that is quite different from the governance structure outside the living labs. And so they gather in this experimentation context to allow them to target intervention that go beyond the strict framework of their current mandate to address especially blind spots, hoping to better meet the needs of the population, which is difficult to reach through their traditional knowledge. So I wanted to introduce those different place-based innovation contexts in order to move a little more to a specific, let's say, a more conceptual way of looking at impacts of living labs. So I'll go to the next slide, please. So regarding impacts, the living lab reflect on the benefits that stakeholder might want or need. If there are different stakeholders, it means that there are different type of value being sought. And we often refer to the KSB model, the knowledge social business model, in order to characterize and model value production within a living lab. So let's say we're a living lab, so we produce knowledge. The knowledge, it might be technical, might be practical, might be theoretical, experiential, new perception, or basically a better understanding of the issues and subjects that mobilizes us. So here again, different kind of knowledge is of interest for different kind of actors. We're a living lab, so we aim to create opportunities. So there's definitely opportunities for business development, product and service development, innovation process, new markets, or economic benefits. So these aspects are for sure important to actors such as companies, organizations, or even governments. But opportunity and development are not limited to the business impacts. In a community-based context, referring to the actual impacts other than economical impacts might be a better way to qualify value and to measure the success of a living lab. So last element would be the social dimension. So we're a living lab, we generate social values. What kind of social added value for the actors in a living lab might want? what kind of added value the living lab might have for the society. It could be new social links. It could be a new bond of trust, reciprocity, connectivity, or better collaboration with one's ecosystems, a new mode of intervention on complex issues. So it's a way to look at those different aspects of value. And one thing to keep in mind is that the composition of the actors who participate and collaborate in the Living Lab will have an important influence on the type of value thought and produced by a Living Lab. So to give you a concrete example, I'll move to the next slide, please. And we'll take a closer look to the type of value that are sought by the actors within the Living Lab, the Climate Change Living Lab. So in this context, the entrepreneurs, they seek to and obtain business value when they retain customers and develop new markets. So that's, let's say, a major priority for them. But they also seek and obtain better understanding and prediction of the impacts of climate change. And they also obtain social value when they contribute to the change in behavior of tourism customers through the Living Lab network. So for another important, I chose the 4 helix different kind of actors here. So we will look at the business type of actor. Let's move to the researchers. So the researcher, for sure, there's a major into knowledge production. So the interest is to provide and to develop new and specific knowledge in the Living Lab. The social aspect is quite interesting for sure, because they access citizens who are wishing to be involved within the research. And there's also a business aspect to their implication, which is to fund applied research project. Let's move on to the citizens. What are they looking for when they participate to this Living Lab? Well, for sure, there is the business aspect. So they maintain economic vitality and access to jobs. They get involved in solving an issue that threatens their access to the practice they value. So there's definitely a social value there. And they better understand the local issue around climate change. And for public authorities, let's say, what could be the social value that me on top in this specific context, because they learn how to better service the population's need, actually, through the knowledge that is brought through the Living Lab. And they better support the business with regards to climate change. And they better prioritize for climate change adaptation in the land use planning. So I think it's quite interesting to sometimes to take this value model and to bring into concrete examples in order to verify, what kind of let's say interests the different actors might have. They all have a major and a minor aspects, and it's interesting to see how they can come together to create all those different value at the same time.
This is really interesting. Thank you so much, Jean-Francois.
If I can add 2 different things on this before we switch to the other one.
Yeah,
the 2 different elements. Earlier on, I was talking about stakeholders that can have different objectives and different interests, but have a common need for innovation. That is the example of it, the illustration of this principle. And Living Labs are platforms that can be adapted to objectives and context, and this is one of the wonderful things about Living Labs. So it's not about having the same cookie cutter Living Lab in every different community, but really understanding this question of adoption platform project in terms of who's in place, what is the context in the community, and adapting the Living Lab to the context rather than follow the cookie cutter approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important for it to be context specific. You had another point as well, or?
Oh, that was both of them. So the different interests but common need, and adapting the process to the initiative rather than the other way around.
Wonderful. Thank you for adding that. I really like that you introduced, Jean-Francois, the knowledge, social, business, values model. I think it's extremely useful to see the different perspectives and the different interests, different, like what's in it for different people when you go through something that is as demanding as a living lab as well, because we understand this is not like a cookie cutter approach to just to use your expression, Hugo. So thank you for introducing that model, and also for showing us that living labs can be used in community-led context, but also in business-led models, and can be adapted to different settings and contexts, and convening different stakeholders as well. So a great diversity of experiences. I think it will give our participants lots of ideas about how we can apply this. We can move on to the next. So we've heard about the benefits of living labs. Now I'd like to hear about the challenges. So what are some of the challenges that you have encountered in your work when implementing living labs, or facilitating the process for the community to implement living labs? And also if you could touch upon the sustainability issue of living labs.
A lot of the challenges come from the distributed value and the collaboration between a diversity of stakeholders that have different objectives. So like one of the challenges that we see is, first of all, the understanding of what a living lab is and the role of each stakeholder within it. So here we're going to be talking about making sure that we take the time to train properly in a manner adapted to each stakeholder. We're not going to be training about living labs, the researchers, the same way we're going to do with public actors, citizens, etc., etc. Also, making sure that people understand that it's not because it's a collaborative approach that everybody has to do everything together all the time. Some will be more mobilized for some parts and less for some other parts. And this usually a question where the confusion kind of puts people in the defensive and saying like, wow, do I have to do all of this? Is like, no, there's a shared stewardship of the initiative, and you're going to be more mobilized here and there. At the end of the day, there's always this question of bringing living lab activities to life in a tangible way. So yes, there's training, there's explaining, but there's also this question of let's learn by doing, let's do some activities, and then people get to say like, oh, okay, now I understand what you mean when you're talking about co-creation, exploration, prototyping, evaluation, for example, and when you're talking about real life conditions, etc. So bringing the activities to life is a great way to bring people to really understand what it is, what it isn't, and the role within it. Another big challenge is the question of creating a collaborative environment, and this one can be roughly translated in building trust. So there's this whole idea of having rules of engagements and clearly defining the roles and responsibilities, and ideally co-constructing them with the stakeholders that will participate. There's always this question of fostering, especially in the beginning, fostering the creation of bonds between the individuals. We always say that confidence in the organizations are reliant on the confidence between the individuals. So making sure that we spend the time to get to know each other at an individual level and really creating this bond between the individuals. Usually we see living labs, or historically or sometimes we see living lab deployed in contexts in which a top-down approach didn't work and they're trying to change the way they do things. So we need here to stay aware that there's pre-existing power dynamics and histories between the actors. So really making sure that that we stay aware and we address them proactively. A living lab is a facilitated process. So what we're going to want to have is a facilitation team that is not only competent, but that is also neutral. Neutral in reality and perceived as neutral. So in other words, don't try to wing it. Try to make sure that you train, try to make sure that you get competent people to help you, and making sure that through the process of writing your living lab charter, through the process of, and now I forget the English word for reddition de compte, is done, for example, to the partnership rather than to some individuals. So really making sure that people feel comfortable with the fact that it's a neutral process and their own benefits and their own value they're seeking, accountability. Thank you very much, Jean-Francois. is taken care of. There's also, you were talking not only about launching, but the question of sustainability. There's this question of maintaining stakeholder engagement over the long term. There's there's some parts here where we were talking about understanding the objectives and delivering, making sure that we make everybody's objectives explicit and to ensure through different processes a fair distribution of these benefits. What's great also about Living Labs is that value is not only created at the end. Value is created throughout the process, throughout every cycle, and through every iteration that we do. So really making sure that we keep delivering continuous value in terms of, once again, knowledge, in terms of social, and in terms of business/impact value that is generated. And at the end of the day, through the facilitation process, there's always this question of not only making sure that we get to the objectives, but also this question of recognition and making sure that we ensure that participants feel that they're contributing with their knowledge, their expertise, and that they're recognized for it at the same level as the others. And then we get to the killer question, which is the question of financing. Since there's different kinds of values being created and that's distributed among different stakeholders and the larger community, the financing can be sometimes complex because it will come together from a diversity of sources. So we will see some funds from research programs, some from public funds, innovation programs, for example, some from philanthropic funding, et cetera, et cetera. And usually every funder has its own criteria, which will make it easier for some partners to apply for one funding and not for the other and vice versa. So there's a certain questions of putting the pieces of the puzzle together in terms of financing. There's also this question of funding of the structure and funding for the project that needs to be addressed here. And in terms of funding, the fact that it does take some time to put the structure in place and start generating results. For example, we were talking about l'Acadie took about a year to do this. We're usually going to be talking about 6 to 12 months or 12 to 18 months, depending on the velocity and the resources of the actors behind the initiatives. So a year-to-year financing is not going to be optimal. Rather focusing here on trying to find longer-term financing, at least for the structure and a couple of projects, to give yourself times to do the things right and put the foundations in place. And then when the structure is in place, it's possible to get funding for further projects, and the projects can be funded on a shorter basis, because we could be talking about projects that go from 3 months to 12 months approximately. So that's what we would be looking at. So basic challenges and strategies in terms of the issues that we see.
Key challenges. Thank you for showing that, Hugo. I really like how this approach really takes care of the whole process. So we're looking for greater impact, but we take care of every component of the process. I see our time flying and lots of questions in the chat box. So I'd like to offer you, Jean-Francois, the opportunity to share with our participants that are interested in Living Labs or that are already involved in Living Labs, perhaps like some piece of advice.
Some piece of advice, yeah.
Move on to the participants' question.
Okay, I'll try to make it quick, maybe 5 minutes at max. So let's start with the general advice. Let's remind us that there is a variety of mechanisms for innovating or collaborating with users. So some of which can be deployed very quickly and some are more on an ad hoc basis. So if we take a systematic change approach, the Living Lab has the advantage of being able to be deployed over the long terms and to host several projects on an ongoing basis in order to innovate with the diversity of stakeholders within the same community. So these are two distinctive elements of Living Labs that require specific governance, management, and facilitation practice. So on a more, let's say, strategic advice, I have 3 little tips. So the first one is, do you really need a Living Lab? It might be sounds special saying this in this webinar, but is the identified need or challenge is of a one-time nature or a more permanent aspect? You know, when we talk about climate change, that's definitely permanent for a long time. Another way of saying it is, does the complexity of the issue make it work? the effort to design a whole living lab structure, or is it more a matter of a project? And don't get me wrong, a single open innovation project can evolve toward a living lab structure, but it's not necessary to set up a living lab structure in order to conduct an open innovation project. My second tip would be take time to set up the condition for success, to have a strong stakeholder coalition, or a strong collaboration team. So first of all, if your problem concerns and interests several actors, are all the key stakeholders present, or at least invited or informed? So we look at actors that are likely to bring relevant heterogeneous point of view to the understanding of the issue. So be open to give the chance to co-define a problem with all the actors, or a certain representative of the actors. Some actors may have already had the opportunity to analyze and identify the problem, but giving others the chance to go through the same process may help to clarify the issues, to ensure that there is a shared understanding of the problem to be solved. And take the time to explore, understand, and validate the need and the barriers to participant engagement. So make it possible to clarify and put on the table the objectives, the fear, the expectations of the actors. It avoids surprise and unspoken needs, and it contributes to the climate of trust that you're looking for within the stakeholders. And finally, Hugo said it earlier, to put all these elements into some kind of collaborative agreement or manifesto helps to reduce the gray area from the start. And maybe this last small tips is to adapt the process to the context of the innovation culture in the community. So assessing the collaborative innovation readiness that we say sometimes might be a good way to start. So when the conditions for successful open innovation are not present, you need to put the effort to ensure they settle in. So you might need to start working on building an innovation community by transferring postures and reflexes of open innovation, such as empathy for the users, or radical collaboration, or systematic approach, or iterative prototyping. And these are all concepts that we hope we will be able to share with you when we have a little more time. But another thing is, like, you need to take time to understand the challenge of the territory where the living lab fits in. So what's the social, economic, political, ecological context in which you are acting? And at what level of action does your living lab frame the issue in which you intervene? So is it public level? Is it sectorial, industrial level? Is it private life? That's quite important. And most of the time, the living lab allows for acting at all levels at the same time. So you need to have strategies in order to co-create at those levels, and also to share experience and share knowledge between these different levels. So I think these are the tips I can give you for.
Yeah, these are very useful pieces of advice, Jean-Francois. That's wonderful. We have many questions in the chat box. I suggest that we move on to questions, and then if you have some final thoughts, we can have them at the end. Connor, would you like to give us the first question?
Yes, for sure. Thanks to everyone for providing your questions. We have lots of questions. I'm not sure if we'll be able to get to all of the questions in today's webinar, but do not worry, we'll make sure to answer your questions, and we'll include those answers in our follow-up email to you all. So our first question is from Martha, and thank you for your question. Martha asks, what is the role of MIS in these living labs? Are they considered a partner, a facilitator, a trainer?
It will depend on the labs.
The same question could be applied to LLio as well, right? Mm-hmm.
It will depend on the labs, and there's a gradient for this. So we do training. So here's a webinar. We're going to be talking about training sessions that we're going to give with LLio and Tamarack at the end of this presentation. We do coaching and mentoring programs. We are co-porteurs, so co-leaders of certain initiatives, but we usually take part in them when there's more of a learning opportunity for new to advance the practice. So there's a gradient of ways in which we intervene.
Yeah, if I may add a little thing, is that in the diversity of actors gathering in the living lab, often MIS or LLio could be looked at researchers as well, because we are there to researchers in terms of applied research as facilitators. We are using research techniques in order to make knowledge emerge from the different actors and to bring them this knowledge into co-creation.
Both of us are at the core capacity builders. So the goal is not to pilot the project, is to make sure that we transfer the skills and the competencies to make sure that you're able to do it autonomously.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, very important if we are talking about like place-based community-led initiatives. Have time for more questions, Connor?
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions, and I'm going to try to find the common strings together. So the first kind of common string is the idea of problem conceptualization and intensification. So it's kind of two components. The first is kind of what defines the type of problems that living labs can address. You know, what kind of what are their limits and what characterizes them. But at the same time, how are community members involved in this identification and conceptualization process?
Can you take this one?
Yeah, take this one with complex problem.
Exactly. Different kinds of problems that you'll meet: simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. So the simple is the land of the benchmark. We know the solution, we just need to apply it. The complicated problems are the land of the best practice. So it's the good practice. So it's the land of the experts. We find the good expert, they give us the right answer. I'll skip the chaotic because we don't have a lot of time. But when we focus on the complex, we're sometimes not even sure what we don't necessarily have a common understanding of what the problem is. We sometimes have different visions of that problem, different points of view. We're usually talking about a social environment in which we're going to have to take iterations because we don't necessarily know how the system is going to react to an intervention. So it's really this question of, are we talking about complex problems? And if we are, then we're talking about real life, iterative group of stakeholders working together and seeing how we generate knowledge and go from there to find our solutions. So it's really that question of adoption parameters within complex settings.
And how do you bring the, I would say just the second part of the question, how do you bring the communities and citizens into the identification of these problems? You have to understand at a certain point when you're a complex systems, what are the barriers? What are the experience of the different people acting in this system? So once you get a real, let's say, map of those different barriers and needs, that at the point where you're ready to start sharing or developing an experiment, which you're gonna bring through different level of activities. So that's really the first start.
And in terms of the citizens, there's usually some capacity building to be done with the citizens and working on the imposter syndrome and building the confidence to go sit with city planners and all sorts of experts with big diplomas and to feel as an equal. So there's some confidence building in terms of the users, but there's also giving a moment for the citizens and the citizens' experiential knowledge to shine in front of the others, sometimes by showing them what happens when they don't have the contextual knowledge in place and they're trying to innovate. So there's, when we were talking about the building trust and building a collaborative environment, it's not a simple endeavor. There's a different strategies and it's a progressive approach to building it, but there's usually this power dynamic that needs to be softened up.
Exactly, and it's a mindset that develops. It's not most of the time not something that emerges by itself. It takes time in order to create this mindset of open innovation. Yeah.
Sorry, Jean-Francois, I interrupted you, but we often say that collaboration moves at the speed of trust, right? And how do you build that confidence so that people with lived and living experience are at the same level as other stakeholders because they are the ones that know best. We know that from experience at Tamarack. They know best like what the barriers are in the system because they face them daily. So sorry, Jean-Francois, did you want to add something else?
No, it's okay. I just took that quote. I really like it.
Wonderful. So we might have time for a real quick question, because I'd like to take a few minutes at the end to share some announcements. Do we have a quick one, Connor, or shall we leave them for the first webinar email?
Yeah,
Yes or
I'm
no,
looking.
rapid fire.
Yeah, I'm looking at all the questions, and I don't think. Oh, actually, this one's a quick one. I've just. This is from DMM. Thank you for your question. Is there any recommended evaluation frameworks for living labs?
Oh, this is not a quick one. But thank you for sharing that great question. I don't know if you just want to say, like, just very quickly, if there, like, what is your favorite framework, and maybe if we have more resources, then we can forward them to our participants.
That's one for Jean-Francois. The floor is yours.
There's no one stabilized framework for evaluating living lab right now. Like the researcher communities and practitioners are right now focusing on working on how to evaluate impacts of living lab. So there is, depending on the context, if you are in more of a social development or social innovation living labs, you will bring evaluation that is more from this context. And when you are more on the enterprise and business living lab, you are looking at another context of evaluation. For sure, one thing that is interesting is that there is always an influence. Maybe it's too long, but there's always an influence of the evaluation framework on what you are going to produce and what you are going to share in terms of results. So it's important to have the right framework, and it's most of the time it's something that you need to create and to co-create. It's not something that comes from the outside. It's something that has to be maybe interpreted from the outside, but you need to co-develop your own framework of evaluation right at the beginning with the different stakeholders.
So again, no cookie cutter in these kind of approaches, but we'll make sure to share some resources with our participants for those who want to know more. So I would like to thank you very much, both of you. We really appreciated you walking us through the living labs and getting us excited about this methodology and the potential that it yields. So I see our time is up. So again, thanks a lot to our two speakers you did a wonderful job. And thanks to all participants for joining us today, for sharing resources, comments, and asking great questions. We hope to see you in 2022 for the workshop. And in the meantime, I wish you all a great holiday season. Stay safe. And thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.